Presentation, very informative on some of the issues we'll have to deal with. Moving into our last presentation for this part of the session, Thorbjørn Lundsgaard was going to be with us today, but unfortunately was unable to travel at the last minute. He has recently graduated as an LL.M. in International Law at Brookes University, holds a Master of Science in Development Management from the University of Agder, Norway, and also holds a Masters of Philosophy in Peace Studies and Conflict Resolution from the Arctic University in Norway. I'm going to speak to us today about corporate social responsibility. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to present here today. And apologies, I can't attend in person. My name is Thorbjørn Lundsgaard, and I'm an independent researcher based in Copenhagen. So today I'm going to make quite a simple and straightforward argument, and that is that the time has come to develop CSR guidelines for space. And I should say that this presentation I'll be summarizing from a full-length research paper, which I will be happy to share afterwards with anyone interested. And let's see if I can find the next slide here. Yes, so in that paper I base my analysis on space law, international law, and existing terrestrial CSR guidelines. And I aim to focus on what lessons can be learned from these fields and what basis and direction they may provide by extrapolation and with the necessary modifications to the space environment for a new set of soft CSR guidelines for space industries. So my point of departure is that recent developments in space law, international law, and CSR seem up until now to have been running on somewhat parallel trajectories without consideration of the mutual implications of these disciplines or what should happen when they intersect. And let's see, there we go. Firstly, taking terrestrial CSR, this can be seen to have evolved to fill gaps in national legal and policy frameworks. For example, where political consensus is lacking or where binding legislation was not the most appropriate regulatory tool, but where mechanisms were nevertheless needed to promote greater certainty of expectations for businesses and other actors, and also strengthen business social license to operate in the community. Gradually, we can also say CSR standards have moved from a voluntary to a more normative character, reflecting stronger buy-in businesses to the concept and converging understandings of what CSR in practice means. The European Commission, for example, now defines CSR as the responsibility of enterprises for their impact on society, with an associated obligation on enterprises to have in place a process to integrate social, environmental, ethical, human rights, and consumer concerns into their business operations and core strategy in close collaboration with their stakeholders. Now, of course, in the context of realization of Earth's limited resources and the prospects of a new economic adventure in space have resulted in growing interest for harvesting resources from the Moon, Mars, or near-Earth asteroids. But while the first space race between governments today, a second space race is one in which private actors compete in areas like tourism, transport, exploration and extraction of resources, which raises the question of the applicability of CSR in space. However, terrestrial CSR standards and the triple bottom line of social, environmental and financial responsibility include some elements that are redundant for space companies, such as local community impacts, and lacks other elements to address the obvious and distinctive social risks posed by space industries, such as space junk or back contamination. Moreover, on the basis of my research to date, none of the pioneer space companies has developed policies, guidelines, or statements on CSR or about their relations to society. Likewise, the space industry's role in society and sustainable economic and human development and its potential for positive social impact has scarcely been investigated. So, moving to consider space law, we know international legal instruments govern state actions in outer space, amongst other, for instance, via the Outer Space Treaty. We also know that beginning in the 1980s, the fast development of commercial space undertakings, which trailed the privatization of worldwide telecommunications administrations, for example, Intelsat and EU-Telsat, has prompted the rapid progress of national level rules and regulations addressing corporate activity in space. Of course, we might think here of the US Commercial Space Launch Act of '84, written to assist the progress of private space commercialization, or more recently, we could mention the Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and the Entrepreneurship Act of 2015, and the US Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, which requires the President of the United States to promote the right of United States commercial entities to explore outer space and utilize space resources in accordance with the existing international obligations of the United States, free from harmful interference and to transfer or sell such resources. And of course, several other countries are writing space laws, including states with small space undertakings wanting to attract foreign investment. Yet, the legal framework addressing these corporations in space is incomplete and still in development, with uncertainties and gaps over environmental and social responsibilities, and international lawmaking processes concerning space can be extremely slow. Here we can also observe how the impact of long-standing mistrust between nations and the political and economic climate on space law developments, for example, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, have pointed out several times that they might not sign the Code of Conduct for Outer Space because they were barely included in its evolution, and think it could be a device to restrict the future ability of emerging powers in outer space. On the other hand, political and civil society interest in space, corporate activity in space, and corporate accountability is quickly increasing. So, I suggest there is a need for norms to address responsible corporate conduct in space. But moreover, the development of CSR guidelines for space would stand to benefit space industries themselves. If we think here in terms of what could be the business case for non-binding or soft CSR guidelines for space, amongst advantages for space companies could be securing greater certainty over social expectations on them, even in the face of legal gaps or political impasse, norm making that is more dynamic, faster, and able to respond more quickly to new scientific discoveries or technological developments than traditional lawmaking processes. Third, promoting social license to operate through stakeholder dialogue and providing a better basis for continued investments. Safeguarding individual and collective corporate reputation of space companies, and driving convergence in expectations and acting as a pathfinder process, preparing the way for later legal developments. Let's see. So if this case, I suggest, for CSI guidelines in space is accepted, what then should be the contents of such guidelines? As mentioned, terrestrial CSR standards do not offer a complete match with the high risk or emerging issues you would expect extraterrestrial CSR norms to deal with. Some elements of the UN Global Compact, for instance, would appear redundant, and other issues are omitted, as I mentioned. If we compare space mining to resource extraction on Earth, we might say health and safety may become even more important or perhaps acute in space. However, new issues over ownership and resource distribution can be envisaged, which may trigger new moral and legal dilemmas. And these should also be addressed in the CSR guidelines. While extraction of resources on Earth has often led to environmental damage, it can be questioned whether celestial bodies should be subject to the same standards, higher or different environmental protection. Terraforming, for instance, creating Earth-like biosphere and colonization will result in large-scale changes of the environment. Jatkowski, back in the 90s, has written about the ethical problems that could arise in this respect, and proposes questions like, does Mars as a planet have any intrinsic value in and of itself? Is there less intrinsic worth in a planet that is devoid of life than in one with an active biosphere? Should we access and use the resources that are available there, or should we leave them as they are? So here you can see the 10 issues I would suggest be included in CSR guidelines for space. And I have selected these as I set out in my paper on the basis of a survey of space law and policy materials and terrestrial CSR standards. And in the paper, I also elaborate further on how the guidelines for each topic might be formulated, of course. And in this regard, I would further suggest that corporate signatories to the CSR guidelines should be asked to commit to adhere to the guidelines to the best of their ability in order to encourage companies to join rather than disincentivize participation by taking too strict or compliance-based approach in the first instance. So finally, how could we move forward to the development and adoption of such guidelines? And two major issues to consider here. To begin with, as I set out, are where and with whom such an initiative should be anchored, and what the processes of development should be. As regard the first, some options are anchored new space CSR guidelines with existing terrestrial CSR initiatives, such as the UN Global Compact or the OECD Investment Committee, which runs the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. Another option could be with international space industry regulatory bodies, such as UNOSA, or it could be with space industry associations, or with a new standalone body or association. Well, and I would be very interested to hear your thoughts and views on this point. Too bad I'm not present. But secondly, as to process, I would suggest that there would be a need to consult in the first instance with the space industry companies in order to position the guidelines and the initiative optimally within the industries, taking into account, for instance, the different subsectors and the characteristics of their participants, their weight within the overall industry, and etc. So followed by a process of multi-stakeholder dialogue, firstly to convene stakeholders who are not up until now really forming a distinct constituency, and to validate principles suggested by the industry in the end. So that concludes my presentation here. Thank you a lot for listening.
Presentation. I don't know if you can hear any questions. We'll give you a couple of minutes for questions.
Sorry, I'm having difficulties hearing here.
Microphone. There's no microphone. You just have to talk louder.
Yeah, but tell him.
Yeah.
Tell him. He can't hear us. He couldn't hear.
Couldn't hear me. So.
No, he can. Can you hear me, Philip?
Yes.
Yep. So yeah, he can hear as well.
Yeah.
What's the question?
Is there a question?
Any questions for Thorbjørn?
Answer the slide.
Would this set of guidelines be in the form of law or remain as guidelines?
Can you hear the question, Philip?
Yeah, they will be guidelines, non-judicial guidelines. So they will not be binding, and they will only apply for corporate entities.
Okay, no other questions? Thank you very much for the presentation.
Yep. Thank you.